Hello and welcome back to chapter number 10 of this lecture series on CCNA Cybersecurity Operations with me, Joachim Kärrestad from the University of Skövde. In this lecture we will go deeper into endpoint protection and endpoint vulnerability assessment distributed into two different parts. And what this basically is about is threats against endpoints, mainly hosts, and how we can protect ourselves and hunt for infections in those environments. So if we just start with looking at threats against endpoints, there are a lot of them, and endpoints are usually being attacked, perhaps not as the end goal of an attack, but as a way into a network. So if you, for instance, want to get control over or get a foothold in the server infrastructure of an organization, it's usually far easier to get a foothold on a client using, for instance, phishing or spear phishing or some other technique, and then use that foothold to pivot into somewhere else in the network. And this is why, the main reason, I guess, for why there are so many threats or why endpoints are such a viable attack vector is because the endpoints are being used by the end users, and the end users is usually an attack vector that an attacker can use to get into a system, because there are essentially many ways to attack the human nature to get access to a computerized system. So if we want to take some numbers, over 75% of all organizations experienced adware infections between 2015 and 2016. So that's 3/4 of all organizations that had adware infection. Adware, which is basically malware that provides unsolicited advertising. And the global spam, the total volume of spam globally is estimated to be over 3,000 messages per second. So 3,000 messages per second are being sent as spam all over the world, and about 8 to 10% of those messages can be considered to be malicious. So I guess you all had the spam saying something about you should buy Viagra for the best price, or there are so many emails that we consider spam, from which can contain advertising, rude messages, whatever, and 8 to 10% of the spam messages are considered to even be malicious. So some kind of perhaps phishing related, something that contains malware, stuff like that. Actually, malware targeting Android was one of the most common malware types in 2016, and I think that this development we have had in technologies over the last decade is very interesting when it comes to security. We've gone from a world where basically everyone or a lot of people use PCs, Windows-based PCs, and a few esoteric persons use Mac, and even fewer use Linux. And back in those days, it may be true that most viruses or most malware was written for Windows, because that's the biggest market. But as I'm sure you can appreciate, now with the advent of IoT devices and smartphones and pads and stuff like that, we can see a huge increase in Linux-based devices and Mac OS-based devices, because the mobile devices are either Android or Mac OS or iOS. And for this reason, we have more malware or more attacks targeting those mobile devices, of course, and malware targeting Android was one of the most common malware types in 2016. And the thing here is that we still leave our portable devices, our cell phones, our touchpads, we still leave them undefended, so they become a very, very vulnerable attack vector, or a very good attack vector to use for an attacker. You should also know, when we talk about malware, that several types of malware has been found to significantly change features in under 24 hours to avoid detection. So it's not uncommon that a malware infects an endpoint, and then within a network it manages to change features and work in another way and have a different file signature before moving on to another host, making it harder to detect. So, while many attacks like the ones we talked about originate from the outside world, there are also several attacks that originate from inside the own network, and there are two internal elements to secure to make sure that we have a good defense. And of course, we need to secure endpoints, the endpoints themselves, and this includes not only computers but also cell phones, servers, printers. Everything that has a computer is something that can be infected and can be taken over. But we also need to secure the network infrastructure, and this is both to have a good edge protection to protect ourselves from the outside world, but we also need to have some internal protection, internal firewalling, internal IDS to ensure that we are also somewhat secure or fairly secure against internal threats. So going into it a little bit more technically, we have malware protection, which we can basically implement in two different ways, host-based or network-based, where the first one we're going to discuss is host-based. Antivirus or anti-malware software is of course used to detect malware in different ways and handle it, and we can do this in three different ways, or there are three common different ways in how on algorithms you can say that are used to detect malware. So the simplest one is the signature based, and those recognize malware based on known malware files. So in this case we have a database of known file signatures, and we match that to new files. So when we do a scan, we match those against file signatures of the local files to see if we have any viruses in that way. The drawback with this is that we can only detect viruses that's been detected before. We won't get any new malware in this way. Then we have heuristic based, and those recognize general features that are shared by several malware types. So they can, for instance, detect different sequences of forks or handles or calls or stuff like that. And then we have behavior based, and those employs analysis of suspicious behavior on itself. So they can trigger when a process behaves in a way that a process should not behave. And those are the three main areas or main versions of anti-malware recognition algorithms. So host-based firewalls and anti-malware programs are essentially programs that are installed at a single endpoint, and they work for that endpoint only. You need one for every single endpoint in your network. And there are suites that include anti-malware, firewalling, safe browsing filters, email filters, and more, of course. There are also several network-based technologies that can provide host protection, and those are essentially similar algorithms or techniques, but we implement them as network appliances or as software on a network appliance. And here we, for instance, have advanced malware protection that provides endpoint protection from malware. We have email security appliance, which is basically a filter that filters for spam and potentially malicious emails before they reach the host, and with the idea of removing stuff that shouldn't even get to the host. Then we have Web Security Appliance, or WSA. This is for filtering and blocking of known bad web pages. And then we have Network Admission Control, or NAC, and this is to ensure that you only permit authorized and compliant systems to access the network. So you don't let rogue access points or rogue DHCP servers into the network at all. And you can do this in a number of different ways. You can do it with password-based authentication, with certificate-based authentication. You can have filters based on MAC address. Those can be spoofed, of course, so it's not so much of a silver bullet, but there are different ways to have admission control for the network. Then I just want to say a word about Cisco AMP, Cisco Advanced Malware Protection. What it does is that it addresses all phases of a malware attack, from breach prevention to detection, response, and remediation. So before an attack, it uses the Cisco Talos intelligence to strengthen against known and emerging threats. So the idea here is that using Cisco AMP, you can rapidly get information about what's happening out there. During an attack, it uses the same intelligence, file signatures, and Cisco threat grid to identify and block attack elements. And after an attack, it can provide controls that can be used to rapidly respond to an attack. So this is quite a nice Cisco technology that you can read more about, but we are moving on to host-based firewalls. And as I'm sure you remember, firewalls block and permit traffic based on predetermined rules, and violations are, if those rules are violated, traffic is usually blocked, and you usually also have a log message that tells you that traffic has been logged. There are also some traffics that can detect suspicious behavior using behavioristical algorithms. And some of the more common host-based firewalls include Windows Firewall for Windows, IP tables, NF tables, and TCP wrappers that are all usually used in Linux environments. In combination to host-based firewalling, we have host-based intrusion detection as well, and host-based intrusion detection and prevention systems are usually the same. So here we usually use HIDS as one term for both intrusion detection and prevention, or you use HIDPS, so you have host-based intrusion detection and prevention system. That's a lot of words for explaining a term. Host-based intrusion detection system is intended to protect against known and unknown malware, and it can monitor and report on, for instance, system configuration, application activity, stuff like that goes beyond file signatures. So as we said, we can still use the same analogy as for network-based intrusion detection and firewalling, where firewall looks at the metadata, the origin of packages, the source of packages, the port number, TCP streams, stuff like that, where the intrusion detection system goes down and looks at the actual payload, the actual data. And in that context, that when we have intrusion detection systems on a host, it can usually be more powerful than a network-based intrusion detection system, because it's not set out of play by network-based encryption. So, for instance, if we communicate using HTTPS or VPN solution, the data payload cannot be evaluated by network-based intrusion detection system because it's encrypted. But once it reaches the host, it will be decrypted, and then it can be evaluated using an intrusion detection and prevention system. So that's good. So the HIDS will usually use a signature-based approach to prevent infection, but it can also detect infection using some other strategies, such as anomaly-based detection, where system behavior baseline is learned, so you know how the system usually works, and then significant deviations from the normal behavior is considered as an incident that will be looked into. We can also have policy-based detection, which is when you describe normal behavior using rules, and rule violations will result in some action. So some programs or products include Cisco AMP, Alien Vault USM, Tripwire, open source, HIDS Security, or OSSEC, which is an open source host-based intrusion detection system. So let's round off with a few slides on application security and stuff and similar. Let's just rehearse that a vulnerability is a weakness in a system or its design that can be exploited by a threat. And also the attack surface is the total sum of vulnerabilities in a given system. So the attack surface for a network is the sum of all vulnerabilities in that network. The SANS Institute described three components of the network surface, or the network attack attack surface towards a computer system. And that's network, software, and human. So any of those three components have a partial attack vector. You can attack any of them in different ways to get access to the computer system. Another term I want to describe is white and black listing, and this is essentially a technique to minimize the attack attack surface. So one way to minimize the attack surface is, of course, to minimize or make one of the components smaller. So the smaller the network, the smaller the attack surface, the smaller the software component, the smaller the attack surface, and so on and so forth. So if we can have less software, the attack surface is made smaller. Installing a new application means that we expand or extend the attack surface. So whitelisting and blacklisting is opposite approaches of controlling what applications that can be installed on a computer using predefined rules. Whitelisting means that we list all applications that are allowed, and everything that is not listed is then denied. Blacklisting, on the other hand, means that we list all prohibited applications, and if we use that approach, all applications that are not listed are allowed. I also want to end with saying something about sandboxing. So sandboxing is a technique that allows files, or perhaps suspicious files, to be executed in a safe environment. And the idea here is that when we find a potential malware, we want to observe it, or we may want to observe it in an environment where it can't do any harm. So if we discover a process or an executable that we believe to be a malware, but that's undetected by signature-based detection, then we want to observe it in a safe environment, because we want to know how it works, and we want to know how we can defend against it. Maybe we want to create a file signature that we can share to the rest of the community and such. And something that you should be aware of is that, for instance, polymorphistic or polymorphic malware will modify itself. So something that you want to do when you have a suspicious malware is that you want to have the original copy of it. And some systems, such as Cisco Advanced Malware Protection, can actually roll back network events, and this allows us to get or to obtain an original copy of a malware, even if it has the ability to modify itself. So the idea here is that we can backtrack a file and get the version of it, the state of it that it was in when it first entered our network. And then there are some different sandboxes that we can use to execute it and look how it works. So one is Coco Sandbox, which is a free malware analysis system sandbox, and there are some online sandboxes, including Virus Total that I use all the time, and malware. So that's the first part of this lecture on host-based or endpoint security. We'll finish off in the next part in the next video, but until then, I'll see you later.